Coast legends these days. Do you feel like you get the love and respect you deserve?
Hopefully Glasses and them take this and run with.
Once upon a time, just mentioning the West Coast meant mentioning Mack 10 as part of power. Gold albums, a supergroup, packed stages, money flowing steadily night after night on tour. But that still was not enough. Mack 10 was never an ordinary name. His name became the embodiment of the luxury every artist dreams of. Mack 10 was a sharp businessman. He quietly built a powerful empire that belonged solely to him. Hoo-Bangin Records ruled over millions of dollars, a lifestyle as lavish as a president's, a net worth large enough to build an entire New York neighborhood. And that was only the polished surface the media chose to promote. Buckle up, because right now, we are stepping into the empire of Mack 10, where money was never the problem. A child raised among gangs, drugs and guns. Diedrich Damon Rollison, later known as Mack 10, was born on August 9, 1971 in Englewood, California. For many who grew up there in the 70s and 80s, the future was often predicted very early. Where you were born, which street you lived on, who you knew, that was enough for others to decide who you would become. And for a child growing up in Englewood, especially on Queen Street, the answer was usually not a good one. Queen Street sits on the west side of Englewood, where the name Queen Street Bloods needs no introduction. It did not exist in newspapers before it existed in real life. By the 80s, the area had become an organized gang clashing with multiple forces, such as the Englewood Family Bloods Neighborhood Crips Avenue Peru and the Crenshaw Mafia Bloods, present in every alley. In that environment, Mack 10 heard the same familiar predictions early on. Sooner or later, he would become like everyone around him. Sooner or later, he would be pulled into gang life. Sooner or later, he would amount to nothing else. But the interesting part is that Mack 10 did not think that way. He did not believe that a child born in a certain place was forced to become a carbon copy of that neighborhood. And from that belief, he began walking a very different path. Mack 10 did not join a gang to wear a label. He kept relationships just close enough with older figures enough to earn respect, enough not to become a target, and enough to survive in that environment. He understood the street code, but he did not turn it into a profession. Like many American boys, Mack once carried a very clean dream. He dreamed of becoming a football player, dreamed of the NFL as a legitimate way out of Englewood. He trained, stayed focused, and believed sports could be his ticket off Queen Street. But after going far enough down that road, he realized his body and circumstances did not support that dream. And just as that door closed, another one opened. Hip-hop came into Mack 10's life. His writing ability gradually drew attention at the local level. He joined a group called First Amendment. The name sounded small, but the role was big. There, Mack learned how to stand in front of a microphone, how to turn personal experience into words with weight, and most importantly, how to keep his voice from being swallowed. From Queen Street to his first studio session, it was not a breakout moment. It was a quiet process. And it was that quiet persistence that laid the foundation, the stage path, and a rising career. The year 1994 was the moment the first real door opened for Mack 10. When Ice Cube brought him onto the remix of What Can I Do, it was not just a guest appearance. In the West Coast world at that time, Ice Cube was a stamp of authority. Standing next to Cube meant the name Mack 10 was no longer seen as a local Englewood rapper, but as someone the system was paying attention to. For many young artists, that was a dream. For Mack 10, it was a signal that the road he was on could lead to money, power, and long-term survival. Just 1 year later, in 1995, Mack 10 signed with Priority Records. This was the most important shift in his career, because it marked the first time he stepped into the real money system of the music industry. Priority was not just a label, it was the machine that turned street rap into a global commodity. Once Mack 10 entered that world, everything began to change in speed, scale, and pressure. His debut album bearing his own name was released and did not take long to earn gold certification. From that point on, the money started flowing. No longer just a few small shows or neighborhood recognition, but income from albums, tours, bookings, and merchandise. Every record sold was another step further away from Queen Street. The rise did not stop there. When Westside Connection formed with Mack 10, Ice Cube, and WC, everything was pushed to another level. Westside Connection was a supergroup, and a supergroup in West Coast rap meant market power. The album Bow Down landed like a declaration, a statement that the West Coast still controlled the game. Sales chart positions and media attention all converged at once. Alongside Westside Connection, Mack 10's solo career continued to accelerate. Albums like Based on a True Story and The Recipe both went gold. That showed he was not just riding the supergroup's momentum, but had real independent selling power. That streak of success created the sense that Mack 10 had found a sustainable formula. Each new project did not just bring money, it reinforced his position as a reliable name within the West Coast ecosystem. When music had already taken him to the top, film doors began to open. Appearing in movies like Anaconda was not just about artistic experience. It created another income stream and pushed Mack 10's image beyond the rap community. He was no longer seen only as a rapper, but as a pop culture figure. Every role and every on-screen appearance expanded his reach and personal brand value. At this stage, Mack 10 seemed to have it all: fame, money, market power, and recognition. Englewood had entered big money alongside him. But it was precisely when everything rose at once that a quiet question began to surface. In a world where money and power always walk together, what matters is no longer who stands next to you on stage. It is who stands behind you and what they want from that position. Internal conflict and the decision to leave nothing lasts forever, not even the name you once called family. Westside Connection, according to the official and polished explanation, ended because it no longer aligned with a shared direction. But what was the truth? More specifically, Ice Cube's brother-in-law gradually became an unofficial fourth member within the Westside Connection ecosystem. No contract, no group credit, but an increasingly heavy voice in behind-the-scenes decisions. To Mack 10, this was a dangerous sign. He chose diplomacy. He spoke privately with Ice Cube not once, but many times. He tried to explain that the issue was not personal, but that the power structure was shifting off balance. Those conversations brought no change. What Mack 10 received was not a response, but silence. For Mack 10, this was the moment he realized the rules of the game had changed. What was once built on music revenue and influence was now being driven by blood ties. Decisions were no longer made in the studio or on stage, but at the family dinner table. Ice Cube, despite being a symbol of power, was no longer the only voice. In that context, Mack 10 understood that if he stayed, he would lose control over his own destiny. The decision to leave Westside Connection was made official. Immediately, many people in the industry assumed the name Mack 10 would soon disappear. They had seen that script too many times. A black rapper who once rose in a group breaks away with high expectations, then quickly slides downward, loses stages, loses contracts, and eventually exists only as a name recalled in nostalgia. Many believed Mack 10 would follow that same path. Without a supergroup backing him, without the collective spotlight, his name seemed destined to die fast. But reality moved in a completely different direction. Mack 10 continued earning amounts of money that many solo artists could not even imagine. At the peak of his solo run, his performance fee ranged from $25,000 to $50,000 USD per show. Put into the context of that era, the comparison becomes very clear. In the late 90s, a Beverly Hills mansion cost around $3 to $5 million USD. At $50,000 USD per night, Mack 10 needed only about 100 shows to reach the value of a luxury mansion. Even at the lower rate of $25,000 USD per night, the number was still within reach. That was when many people were forced to look again and admit that Mack 10 did not just survive as a solo artist. He was making money in a way very few truly understood. Assets, net worth, and Hoo-Bangin Records. When it comes to Mack 10's assets, many people instinctively picture flashy mansions, expensive supercars, or glittering diamond chains. But that is the common view, and also the shallowest one. Mack 10's multi-million-dollar empire was never built from concrete or chrome. It was built on something very few rappers of his generation truly owned: ownership. As early as 1996, while his career was still at its peak and money was pouring in from albums, tours, and Westside Connection, Mack 10 founded Hoo-Bangin Records. This was not the decision of an artist afraid of the future. but a calculated move by someone who could see beyond the spotlight. While many rappers were still busy enjoying fame, Mack 10 was already laying the groundwork for a money system that could exist independently of the stage. In its early phase, Hoo-Bangin Records operated as an imprint under Priority Records and Capitol. This gave Mack 10 a double advantage. On one side was top-tier distribution pushing product directly into the major market. On the other was steady income from revenue-sharing rights rather than just artist fees. From that point on, Mack 10 was no longer making money only from standing in front of the microphone, but from owning what came out of that microphone. A catalog began to take shape, and a catalog never sleeps. Even when media spotlights no longer shined as intensely as before, Mack 10's cash flow never disappeared. It simply became quieter. Hoo-Bangin was never a trend-chasing label. It operated like a cultural safe. Recording masters' exploitation rights, licensing, touring legacy. All of it formed a financial ecosystem that outsiders could rarely see in full. When Hoo-Bangin entered a distribution partnership phase with Fontana Distribution, Mack 10 further solidified his position as a true boss. He worked with West Coast artists who had loyal fan bases, names that did not need a new hit every year to generate revenue. This was steady money, long-term money, money built on control. Because of that, estimates of Mack 10's net worth have always fluctuated, ranging from around $6 million to $15 million USD. That gap is not a sign of opacity, but proof that much of his wealth exists in forms that are extremely difficult to value. Catalogs. Real estate music exploitation rights and touring income streams do not appear as clearly on paper as a bank account. Of course, compared to Ice Cube, Mack 10 is not the bigger name. But when it comes to real wealth that is sustainable and tightly controlled, Mack 10's assets are not up for debate. He does not need to be the richest face of the West Coast. He only needs to ensure that his money does not depend on anyone else. And that is the most dangerous kind of wealth in this industry. Life tragedy. The marriage with T-Boz. The marriage between Mack 10 and T-Boz was once seen as a symbol. Not just because they were famous, but because they represented two of the most powerful worlds in American music in the late 90s. On one side was West Coast rap, with money influence and market control. On the other was R&B with mass appeal media reach and a clean image. When those two names stood together, the public did not see two individuals. They saw a power couple, a combination believed to be perfect, carrying both street authority and mainstream acceptance. Their wedding took place when both were at their brightest peaks. Mack 10 was still benefiting from the height of Westside Connection and his solo career, while T-Boz was a member of one of the most successful female groups in history. The media did not need to dig deep. The image alone sold the story. A good-looking couple, wealthy, powerful, and seemingly untouchable. But that idealization hid many things behind the curtain. The marriage did not last long. When T-Boz filed for divorce, the story immediately took a completely different turn. No longer romance or shared success, but serious allegations appearing in legal filings. Violence threats, control, infidelity. Words that had never been associated with the power image Mack 10 had built over many years. From that moment, the marriage was no longer a private matter between two people. It became a public case dissected in courtrooms and across headlines. What made the situation heavier was not just the content of the allegations, but the coexistence of two versions of truth. In court documents, T-Boz detailed what she claimed happened behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Mack 10 denied everything. He argued that the allegations were made to gain leverage in the divorce and custody battle. Two narratives, two perspectives, and no public ruling definitive enough to end the debate in the public eye. That gap created a dangerous situation. Truth was trapped between testimony and silence. For Mack 10, this was the worst possible outcome. He was someone accustomed to controlling his own narrative to actively shaping his image. This time, the story was not in his hands. It lived in legal files, newspaper headlines, and backstage whispers he could not control. The media reacted quickly. What had once been considered appeal suddenly became risk. Radio stations grew distant. There were no official statements, no public bans, but the atmosphere clearly shifted. In this industry, silence often speaks louder than any press release. Mack 10 was not convicted, but he was no longer welcomed the same way. The image of the West Coast boss began to be questioned at the exact moment he had just lost Westside Connection. his biggest source of income and power backing. That period was devastating in terms of image. If the collapse of the marriage had happened while Mack 10 was still at the peak of the group, the impact might have been different. But it happened just as he had left a supergroup, lost collective identity, and was standing alone before the public. Lost the group, lost the image, lost media endorsement. 3 consecutive blows, none of them coming from music. Notably, Mack 10 did not choose a loud counterattack. He did not rush to the media to explain himself, nor did he turn his family story into a publicity tool. His silence confused many people, but it also reflected the person he had always presented himself to be. Someone who believed real power lay in not needing to say too much. But in that context, silence did not help the image. It only allowed the void to be filled with speculation. The broken marriage left more than reputational damage. It left deep cracks in Mack 10's personal life. The roles of husband, father, and man, caught between spotlight and privacy, were stretched to the breaking point. What he had built in public life no longer felt sufficient to protect private space. And when someone used to controlling everything loses control over his own story, it becomes a blow to identity itself. The tragedy here is not about who was right or wrong. It lies in the fact that an image of power built over many years was shattered by something that cannot be measured in money or sales: private life. There is no contract, no strategy, no system strong enough to shield you when personal matters become public focus. Mack 10 could control masters' catalogs and labels, but he could not control how the public viewed a failed marriage. And just as everything seemed to hit bottom, when career, image, and personal life were all damaged, another incident emerged. This time, it did not come from the courtroom or the media. It came from his own body. A silent betrayal, more dangerous than anything before. The health shock the body betrays. The health shock of 2011 came to Mack 10 in a way no balance sheet could ever predict. For years, he had been used to controlling everything around him. Money could buy time, buy silence, buy second chances. Power could open doors, shut down disputes, and make others wait. But the body does not negotiate. When it betrays you, everything else immediately becomes meaningless. That year, Mack 10 was hospitalized with diverticulitis, a serious intestinal condition. It was not the kind of fatigue that rest could fix, nor an injury that could be postponed. It required emergency surgery. In that moment, Mack 10's world shrank to a hospital room. White lights and life or death decisions made in silence. No stage, no studio, no market power. Only the body and a basic question he had never truly faced before. Would he even live long enough to continue everything he had built? Before this shock, Mack 10's story had always revolved around money and power. How many albums sold? How many shows per night? How many masters were owned? But from a hospital bed, those numbers suddenly felt distant. Not because they disappeared, but because they no longer mattered most. For the first time in decades, Mack 10 was forced to shift from an expansion mindset to a survival mindset. Not how to increase influence, but how to keep the body functioning. This shock exposed a truth few in the entertainment industry dare to admit. Power has limits. Money has a ceiling. You can own catalogs, labels, real estate, but you cannot buy a healthier liver or an inflammation-free intestine. For someone used to having everything operate on his terms, that helplessness was deeply awakening. Mack 10 did not speak much about that period, but the silence itself spoke volumes. After surviving surgery, Mack 10's pace of life began to change, not in the form of repentance or complete retreat, but adjustment. He no longer chased packed schedules just to prove he was still relevant. Instead, he became selective, choosing shows, choosing timing, choosing environments, and most importantly, choosing to spend time with family in ways he had often postponed before. Family, once pushed aside by work money and power, suddenly became a non-negotiable priority. The role of father was no longer a title running alongside a career, but the center of daily life. Mack 10 began to be present more often not on stage, but in everyday moments. This was not disappearance. It was a different form of presence, quieter, but more durable. That shift was also reflected in how he approached work. Hoo-Bangin Records continued to operate, but no longer with the frantic pace of someone trying to prove something to the world. It ran like a mature system. No need for display. No expansion at all costs. Mack 10 no longer stood on the front line of every decision. He observed more, intervened less. His power did not vanish. It settled into a calmer state. The health shock of 2011 became an invisible dividing line in Mack 10's life. Before it was a phase of ambition, expansion, and control. After it was a phase of awareness, limits, and choice. He did not lose his entrepreneurial instinct or power-driven thinking, but he understood that if he continued living the same way, everything he had built could collapse for one simple reason. The body could not take it. What stands out is that Mack 10 never turned his health story into a media tool. No long interviews, no moral lectures. He let it pass as a part of life only those involved fully understood. That is what made the shock real. No embellishment, no emotional exploitation. Just a man forced to confront his own fragility. At a time when many rappers either chose to disappear completely or cling to the spotlight at all costs, Mack 10 chose a harder-to-see path. He did not leave the game, but he no longer stood at its center. He stayed in his own way as someone who understood that survival matters more than domination, and presence matters more than display. After everything that happened, the question is no longer whether Mack 10 has enough money or enough power. The question is how he will use the rest of his life. Fade from the lights, or remain in a different form, quieter, but more sustainable? And the answer, like the man himself, has never been spoken clearly. The man beyond the screen. After everything he has been through, Mack 10 steps away from the public screen in a different form. No longer the dominant West Coast symbol of the late 90s, but never gone from the game either. He did not choose to return with a media explosion. Did not drop a shock album, did not chase the attention of a new generation of listeners. Instead, Mack 10 exists in a quieter state, but one that is far more durable and much harder to erase. At this stage, Mack 10's most important role is no longer on stage or in the studio. It is within his family. The role of father becomes central, not as an image crafted for polish, but as a deliberate life choice. After personal upheavals and a health shock, he understands that real power no longer lies in controlling crowds, but in being present for the people who matter most. Mack 10 does not speak much about his private life, but what he shows reflects a man who has experienced enough loss to understand the value of stability. Alongside family, Mack 10 remains the operator of Hoo-Bangin Records. Not the kind of boss who appears constantly in the media, but the one who holds the structure together. His label continues to exist as a small but solid ecosystem, where West Coast artists can release music, preserve catalogs, and maintain ties with loyal communities. Mack 10 does not expand at all costs. He is not chasing market domination, he is chasing control. And control to him has always been the foundation of success.
And not just entire generations of rappers.
Mack 10 has appeared mainly through nostalgia tours and legacy honoring events. The Cali Classic Tour stages where audiences do not come looking for something new, but to remember a time that has passed. This is not a sign of decline. This is a different form of power. The power of memory. The power of legacy. When an artist can step on stage without needing to prove relevance, that is the moment he has moved beyond the greatest pressure of the entertainment industry.
Comeback wasn't about
Mack 10
chasing.
has also received formal recognition from the community. Plaques of honor and tributes from hip-hop cultural organizations do not come from current sales, but from long-term influence. He does not need to top charts to be mentioned. As long as history remains, his name
The freedom
has a
every
place.
artist dreams
And in
of,
hip-hop,
that
where so
spark,
many names
that
once
fire
burned bright
finally
and then
reignited.
vanished without a trace still being called is already a form of victory. What stands out is that Mack 10 has never tried to rebrand himself as youthful or progressive. He does not chase trends, does not reshape his image to fit new tastes. His presence is
Mack
original.
10 was officially
It is someone who knows exactly who he
that
is
proved the West
and no
Coast
longer
legend
feels the need
still
to
had it.
convince
Mack-
anyone else. That consistency sets Mack 10 apart from many of his peers, those who either disappeared entirely or clung desperately to the spotlight through forced efforts. Success for Mack 10 at this stage is no longer measured by chart
because he
positions
faked,
or
he
streaming
found
numbers.
smarter ways to grow,
It is
to
measured
earn,
by
and
the
to stay
ability to
relevant on
control
his
his own life. He controls his time, controls his schedule, controls what he participates in, and what he declines. In an industry where artists are often dragged into a non-stop cycle, the ability to say no becomes the greatest
Reinvention.
privilege.
If you enjoyed
Mack
this story
10
and
no
want
longer
more
needs the
untold hip-hop,
spotlight to
share this
validate his
video
worth.
and drop.
He does not need constant appearances to remind audiences that he still exists. His existence is already written into history, and history does not need to be updated every year. It only needs not to be erased. Mack 10 understands that, and he accepts a position that is quiet but solid, where he is both part of the past and the current manager of his own legacy. It can be said that Mack 10 never had a flashy comeback in the traditional sense. No album that reshaped the game, no media domination, but he never disappeared either. He remains present in a different way. Less glamour, but more autonomy. Less noise, but more depth. And it is this choice that has redefined his journey. Looking back at the entire story from a boy growing up within the invisible limits of Englewood, to a rapper at the top of the West Coast, then a label boss controlling assets, and finally a man choosing stillness. Mack 10 is not a simple story of victory. He is the story of survival. Someone who learned how to adapt, adjust, and continue existing in one of the harshest industries there is. And at this ending point, the larger question is not only for Mack 10, but for hip-hop itself. In an industry always chasing the new, always pushing older names aside, is the one who survives the longest, the one who maintains control, the longest, the true winner. The answer likely depends on how each person defines success. But for Mack 10, he has already defined it for himself, and he is living with it.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.